Thank you very much, my dear colleague and friend and brother, Ambassador Mushaid Ali, for that wonderful introduction. Actually, I prefer to be called simply as a teacher by training and a diplomat by accident. Very prolonged accident, no doubt. Spanning about 23 years at the UN and about 2 years in my home country, Nigeria. Also, when they call me a troubleshooter, my wife always, who is my reality check, always says, actually, you'll be more trouble than shooting. and it is true, because to be an effective envoy, you have to know when to make trouble and, of course, when not to make trouble. Please feel free to, at the end of my presentation, please feel free to ask me any questions you like, more broadly than the topic, about Africa and about the UN. Although I will still have opportunity, I'm told, to focus much more on the UN and multilateralism and the role of permanent representatives and as well as UN officials in multilateralism. But please feel free to ask me questions that may not necessarily be related or limited to the topic of this morning. However, just one caveat. I would like you to ask me fewer questions on Asia, and in the true spirit of a colloquium, any questions on Asia that I cannot answer, I will pass it on to my colleague Mushaid Ali. Now, the topic of this morning's presentation is conflicts and resolution in Asia and Africa. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the transformation of conflict since the end of the Cold War has actually changed the dynamics of the international system, and thus the approaches towards the management and resolution of conflicts. You recall, if you look at how the UN responded to conflict before this end of the Cold War, most of the conflicts they dealt with were interstate conflicts. But since the end of the Cold Wars, after 1990, most of the conflicts that the UN deals with are intrastate conflicts. That's conflict within countries. So this impacts on the way in which the international community responds, the tools that they use, because you can't use the same tools for resolving interstate conflict with the tools that you need for the more messier intrastate conflict. And when you have to deal with intrastate conflicts, then you have to go to the root causes, which have become a lot more complex. While the effects of these conflicts are increasingly transnational with urgent need for humanitarian responses. For example, if you look at the conflict in the Congo, what is called Democratic Republic of the Congo. Is there any Congolese in this audience? Because before I get a rude question, because sometimes I refer to the Democratic Republic of Congo as neither democratic nor particularly a republic, but certainly the Congo. But that's the kind of thing where the whole structure of the state is open to question. Who is a Congolese is open to question. And where conflict in the Congo are transnational, in fact, to the extent that there was a point in the conflict in the Congo whereby you had some of the neighboring countries fighting each other inside the Congo itself, which means there are certain aspects of this conflict that are not limited to Congo, but have important consequences for the countries of the sub-region. And then, of course, with the massive displacements of people, whether it's in the Congo or Darfur, which I'll talk about a little bit later, or even closer to this period, Syria, where you have hundreds of thousands of people who are displaced and become refugees or internally displaced people. Now, then you need to respond as an international community, not just to try to end the conflict, which is primary, but also how to protect the civilians and how to meet the needs of the IDPs and the refugees. Again, as an illustration, one of the worst things that can happen to any human being is to be an internally displaced person in your own country. You know why? Because if you're a refugee, which is bad enough, At least you are outside your country, you are in a host country, which is your treatment is governed by international convention. You even have a whole UN agency called the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees that is supposed to deal with you. But if you are internally displaced, you are in a sense nobody's business because you are running away from the state. The state is unable to protect you, and you are dependent on the goodwill of NGOs and some other international agencies with no clearly defined rules about how you tend to be treated. Take Darfur, which again I will refer to in more detail in my presentation. You have, at the height of the conflict in Darfur, guess what, 2.1 million internally displaced people out of a total population of 8 million. Okay? That is almost a quarter of the population for whom nobody takes particular responsibility or can be held accountable for their treatment. So that's the kind of dynamics that the conflicts in the post-Cold War era has assumed. And so the United Nations, how do you respond? The United Nations and regional organizations have in varying degrees developed framework for conflict prevention. Because obviously the best way to deal with, the cheapest way to deal with conflict is to prevent them, right? But it's easier said than done. So how have the United Nations and regional organizations developed framework for conflict prevention, and that is before the guns start? Now, if they cannot prevent, how do they deal with the situation when the guns start, which is then conflict management and peacekeeping? And then how do they react when the guns have stopped, which is peace building and post-conflict reconstruction? I must say, again, you will draw your own conclusion, but the international community has not been particularly effective in conflict prevention, nor have they been particularly effective in post-conflict peace building, which is strange, because, why is it strange? Because if you look at the statistics, more than 50% of all global conflicts, violent conflict, even when they are settled, they go back. So there's a very high rate of return to conflict. So you will have thought the international community will spend a lot of time and efforts, you know, to build peace once you are able to bring conflict to an end. But that's not the case. As a matter of fact, give you again another illustration. I was privileged, as Moshahi said, to be the head of this United Nations African Union peacekeeping mission in Darfur until last July, which is the biggest international peacekeeping mission in the world. At about, we're at about 30,000 military, police, and civilian. And guess what? The budget is vary from $1.5 billion to $1.7 billion annually. Imagine if we had spent a fraction of that on post-conflict peace building, on reconstruction, or early recovery. I think we'll have made a lot more contribution to finally sustaining peace. But guess how much am I allowed to spend on early recovery and reconstruction as head of this mission? There's $1.7 billion, $4 million US. So the international community is prepared to spend billions on peacekeeping, but not, I'm very stingy when it comes to post-conflict peace building. Of course, there's something called, which is United Nations Peace Building Commission, and the Secretariat as the support office called Peace Building Support Office of the UN, but in reality, they have not been as effective as they could be. And so what happened to our collective responsibility response through prompt and effective multilateral action? Again, the record is very mixed. If you look at the tragedy of Rwanda, where in 1 month, in April 1994, 800,000 people were killed by the most primitive manner, the genocide in Rwanda. And it was said, oh, yes, you see, what we need to do, what the international community needs to do is early warning, which is nonsense, because some of us, I was ambassador of Nigeria, I was joined in the Security Council as a non-permanent member by the ambassador of New Zealand and the ambassador of Czech Republic. We were shouting in the Security Council that something terrible is about to happen, is happening here, you know? and we were waved off. As a matter of fact, the big powers, particularly the United States, did not want us to use the word genocide. The resolutions, if you look at the resolution coming out of the Security Council at the height of the genocide, they only allow us to say acts of genocide may have been committed or may be going on. Acts of genocide. Do you know why? Because if the Security Council has mentioned genocide, then the big powers are obliged to respond according to the dictates of the International Convention Against Genocide. And the Americans have said that following the experience in Somalia where they lost, I don't know, 11 or 17 soldiers, they said never again will the blood of an American soldier be spilled in an African conflict. And they followed through. So with that experience, they were not interested in going, and they prevented us even from using the word genocide to describe what is happening. The point I'm trying to make is that it's not about early warning. Plenty of warning. It's really early response and prompt and adequate response to global conflict in the spirit of collective security and global solidarity, in the sense that a threat to peace anywhere should be considered a threat to peace everywhere, because you cannot limit, as particularly in the post-Cold War era, conflict can no longer be limited to the state in which it is occurring. It has, in most cases, a lot of regional dimensions. So I hope that when we begin to have an interactive session, we'll discuss what are the mechanisms for conflict prevention, conflict management, post-conflict peacekeeping, and how can we improve the international community improve on this. And I'll, of course, illustrate more with two case studies, the case of Darfur and Myanmar. Now, let me make some general points before I then go into these two cases. First, that if you look at the list of ongoing armed or violent conflicts in Africa, north and south of the Sahara, it contains about 15 cases. By the way, we Pan-Africanists don't like this word sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and South Africa. This is part of the divide and rule tactic. The Sahara has never been a source of divide in Africa. As a matter of fact, how did Islam come to what is called sub-Saharan Africa? It's through the Sahara, through teachers, traders, scholars, Timbuktu in Mali, you've had more of that, for centuries, So the Sahara was a trade route, was a means of connection between north and south of the Sahara, not a permanent divide. But in any case, it's convenient for people to use that. And of course, sometimes some people in some of the North African countries sometimes don't even regard themselves as African. But to me, it's nonsense, because whether they like it or not, they are in the geographical space called Africa, and the Sahara has never been a divide. And if you look at Egypt, which is the leading North African country, they cannot do without, even if they want, the rest of Africa, because the Nile, guess where the source of the Nile is? It's in Africa south of the Sahara, and that's why they've always been at least interested in what happens in the source, because it has tremendous consequences for their very life. But in any case, according to the list that I have, that list of 15 cases, violence, conflict in Africa. But these have been actually in decline. And I will try to argue, maybe later on in my presentation, there's a correlation between the decline in the number of violent conflicts in Africa, a correlation between that and better governance, more stability in the governance, less coup d'etats, less one-party states, and also an increase in this prosperity and economic development of the continent. Now, for Asia, the number of armed conflicts stands at 22 and includes the latest, of course, in East Sabah, where people thought, oh, well, conflict, that's Africa, not Asia, you have that, which has become hot. And imagine if the Philippines had not taken the side of Malaysia against these non-state actors and these renegade people who are fighting, it could be a completely different story. And it's not far away. Somebody drew my attention to the fact that Eastern Sabah is just 1,143 kilometers from Manila, 1,495 kilometers from Singapore, 1,608 kilometers from Kuala Lumpur itself. So it's not far away, and it could have been worse. And so stress the need for conflict prevention, conflict management, and post-conflict reconciliation. Second point, Africa has, contrary to the perception of Africa, and that's why one of the things I hope to do while I'm here for a few months in Singapore is to begin to change the narrative about Africa. As if Africa is just nothing but a continent of conflicts and crises, of disease, AIDS, but not mention some of the tremendous progress being made in the continent. The challenges remain. But more importantly, Africa as a contributor to the maintenance of international peace and security. Africa has the most developed regional organization in the developing world for conflict resolution and peacekeeping. It has the African Union, which has 54 member states, 53 or 54, of course, if you count Western Sahara is 54, but Western Sahara is not yet recognized by the United Nations, but recognized by the African Union. And this was, so that's formed in 2003. And it's the successor to the Organization of African Unity, which was formed in 1963. So that for 50 years, the Africans have had a mechanism. It doesn't always work perfectly, but they have a mechanism for conflict prevention, conflict management, and post-conflict peace building. They also have the equivalent of the UN Security Council. They call it Peace and Security Council, which is served by a Department of Peace and Security under the chairperson of the African Union Commission, the current occupant being the first female to get that position, which is Dr. Zuma, the ex-wife of the President Zuma of South Africa, and the first woman to occupy the leadership of the African Union. There's also the development of an African standby force, where the Africans are actually building 5 battalions, one from each of the 5 regions, to be able to have quick response to conflicts and threats of conflict. Then the Africans have also, through the African Union, they actually have mounted peacekeeping operations. Okay? You have Somalia, where they have been responsible for some of the progress being made on the ground in Somalia, and Darfur, which I've mentioned, and I will mention repeatedly, which is the biggest international peacekeeping mission in the world. About 18,000 troops, 6,000 police, and the rest civilians. And it's principally African troops. So they have a Peace and Security Council, they have standby force, they have mounted peacekeeping operations, sometimes alone, sometimes in cooperation with the United Nations. And they have, as part of they've constructed what they call African Peace and Security Architecture, APSA. And they have something called which is something we have in common with Asia, I think, the respect for elders. They have what they call the panel of the wise, where they have retired presidents who don't have any special interest to be there to be consulted from time to time on key issues or intractable problems, because we equate, of course, wisdom with age, and for most parts there's a correlation, and we just don't dump former president who still have useful roles to play. As a matter of fact, there's a Sudanese-British Mo Ibrahim who have established a foundation to reward those African leaders who have left power voluntarily and governed well, so that there's no panic. Because part of the problem of corruption is that you have people who are so afraid of what to do after leaving office. In other words, that Mo Ibrahim said there's life after public office. And he has given an award for those. I think so far there have been 2 recipients. But there are some years where he gave no award, which is an indictment on the part of the leadership of the continent that there's nobody that is deserving of that. Then the third broader issues that I would like to raise is the nexus between peace, security, development on the one hand, and between peace, development, and human rights and democratization on the others. And it's very interesting that, again, some of the contribution of Africa and Africans to international peace and security, 2 Secretary Generals, the first 2 Secretary Generals from the African continent, Boutros Ghali and Kofi Annan, both of them contributed intellectually and conceptually to how to meet the challenges of peace and development and democratization in the post-Cold War era. It was there. Bruce Gali commissioned 2 seminal reports, and those of you who are interested in peace and conflict studies, please get hold of it, because Bruce Gali was the first post-Cold War Secretary General of the UN, and it was commissioned by an extraordinary meeting of the Security Council at the summit level, heads of state level, 15 heads of state, who asked him, please give us a report, an agenda for peace that will guide international response to conflict in the post-Cold War era. And he produced something called an agenda for peace, which he followed by an agenda for development. And the argument, which I want to repeat, is that there can be no development without peace. At the same time, that's the argument of agenda for peace. And then an agenda for development where he argued that there can be no durable peace without sustainable development either. And then Kofi Annan, who was the second Secretary General from Africa, if you want to use the word Sub-Saharan Africa, from that part of the continent, and he then had an agenda for democratization and human rights, which is called In Larger Freedom, which is also contained in the preamble of the UN Charter, and in which he argued there will neither be peace nor development unless there is respect for the human rights of your people, and also the people have the right to choose the government under which they wish to live. Finally, in terms of general points that I would like to make for consideration and discussion, is that I want to make a reference to Tip O'Neill, the late Speaker of the US House of Representatives, when he said, all politics are local. And in a sense, he's right. But if violent conflicts are breakdown of politics, or normal politics, okay, building consensus, resolving conflict peacefully, then I have to say that conflicts are anything but local in the post-Cold War era. In fact, conflicts have become, as I mentioned to you earlier, not just limited to the country in which it's taking place, but also the neighboring countries and the region and also the continent and maybe the world as a whole. Again, using the example of Darfur, Darfur is just a part of Sudan, but Sudan has about 7 neighbors. Each of them have fought with the government of Sudan at different points and supported different sides in the conflict. So the conflict, therefore, is not limited to Sudan, it's not limited to the region, but as a threat to the stability of Africa as a whole. Now, I would say that the record of the international community in conflict resolution is mixed. On the positive side, there has been about 40% decline in violent conflict since 1992 all over the world. And I think the UN peacekeeping, the regional organizations have made a contribution. But on the other hand, this is not the time for complacency, because as I was mentioning earlier on, when it comes even to this region, conflicts can flare out anytime. So the international community, the regional organization cannot be, should not be complacent. But in order to address this conflict, we have to understand what are the root causes, what are the strategies and capacities to produce negotiated and durable solution. We have to also recognize the nature of conflicts have changed. I have mentioned more intrastate conflicts than before, but more importantly, you now have non-state actors, you know, rebel movements, you know, terrorist groups. In the case of Somalia, you have pirates, you have Al-Shabaab, you know, and the whole of the Sahel, that is the northern part of West Africa, you have these jihadist movements that are real threats to regional and international peace and security. And you cannot react to this conflict in a conventional way. Look at what is happening in Mali. The French went in with helicopters, with planes, but guess what? They are very anxious to leave. You know why? Because they know that that's the easy part. That's the easy part. The more difficult is to sustain the peace, and that's why they want to hand this over quickly. Where are the Africans? Let the Africans come and take over, because they realize it's going to be a long process of trying to keep the peace in that region. Also, we have to, in looking at conflict resolution, why some efforts succeed and why do some efforts fail in conflict resolution and mediation? What lessons can be drawn? My experience has also been both theoretical and practical, because as my colleague Ambassador Ali said, I have been involved in trying to resolve conflict from Angola to Cyprus, to Iraq, to Zimbabwe, to Myanmar, and also finally in Darfur. In other words, I get sent to where nobody else wants to go because of the subtle intractability. And you measure success if you can, A, bring some to a conclusion, as we did in Angola, because I was the last chairman of the UN peacekeeping mission in Angola, and not one single shot has been fired in violation of that ceasefire over which I presided. But you know why? Because the two sides were willing to make peace. So you nudge them, okay? So the parties to the conflict must be prepared. And in case of Angola, one of the leader of the other party was killed, Savimbi. The principal threat to peace was killed. So of course, it was easier to make peace when the main obstacle to peace is removed. Now Angola is one of it may even overtake Nigeria as Africa's largest oil-producing country. And with the Chinese going there in a big way, actually the economy is booming in Luanda and other parts of the. So what were the conditions for success? What were the conditions for failure in Cyprus? Complete failure. There's still not a hot war, but the conflict is still there between the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot. How about Zimbabwe, where again the conflict is not resolved, although they have a unity government? And then you have Myanmar. How come that what was inconceivable 15 years ago, or even less, that Myanmar will now move on the path of democratization? Aung San Suu Kyi will be released. In fact, right this week, I believe, she's having the first meeting of our party, political party, the National League for Democracy, which, by the way, I hope she will rename National League for Democracy and Development. Because if you recall the argument I've made, that the best way to guarantee democracy or to end peace is also to address the issue of development. So it's not just about democracy, because democracy is not an end by itself. You know, as people say, you can't eat democracy. So you have to address the real needs of the people. So, and then in my theoretical approach to handling conflict, I always look for who are the spoilers of the peace process, because they are spoilers. Okay, that is who the actors, real or potential, whether they're leaders or political parties or movement within or outside of a peace process, who constitute themselves as deliberate obstacles to peaceful settlement of disputes and conflict, and they employ violence to achieve their objectives. These are the spoilers. So what types of spoilers are they? What are the objectives? Is it limited objectives that can be accommodated, or is it things that is zero sum that cannot be accommodated? What are the numbers of spoilers? What is the location of the spoilers in the peace process? Are they inside the peace process, or are they outside the peace process? Now, I will end by just talking briefly about both Myanmar and Darfur. In Myanmar, since 1993, in the absence of consensus among the key interested countries on how best to deal with the issues of grave human rights abuses and democracy deficit, the Secretary General has opted for a low-key approach, and he has designated special envoys or special advisors to do the heavy lifting in the process. What has been the approach? One is to bridge the gap between the government and the opposition. Because, interestingly enough, both the government and the opposition see the other as the obstacle to peace. When I first met Jonathan Shui as the special envoy of the Secretary General, by the way, I was the third special envoy of the UN to go to Myanmar. And before I went, my first visit was 2006, nobody has been actually allowed to see Aung San Suu Kyi by the authorities. So, is she alive? Is she dead? Is she sick? Nobody knew. Because the authorities regard her as the obstacle to peace and to democratization in Myanmar. And I recall my first meeting with Tansho when I said, well, Senior General, I want to see Aung San Suu Kyi. He said, we want to see who? Because even the name Aung San Suu Kyi is not normally mentioned. You don't even say the word. You know? I said, yes. I said, why? I said, well, if I'm a mediator, I have to see both sides, you know? He said, okay, I'll thought long ahead. Said, okay, I will let you see her. But I want to warn you that she's very stubborn. She hates us, the military. But she loves foreigners. Maybe she was, guess she was married to one. She loves foreigners. And then she said, above all, she's very stubborn, like all of us Burmese, you know. So you are dealing with parties that are stubborn, parties who believe that the other is the obstacle to peace. Similarly, when I went to see Aung San Suu Kyi for the first time, and I told her, I said, you know, Madam, you have to talk to these military guys. He said, no, I can't talk to them. They are rogues, they are thieves, they try to kill me. You want me to talk to them? So I said, yes, you have to talk to them because, yes, they may be the ones, all of the above, but they're the ones who put you in this detention, and they're the only ones who can get you out of it, okay? Not the Western countries who make all the noise, but the people who put you there are the only ones who can get you out of it. So do you want to remain perpetually in detention, not useful to your party, not useful to your country, you know, not useful to anybody? Or you want a negotiated settlement that will bring you out so that you can contribute your quota to the development of your country? Then she said, well, okay, nobody has ever talked to me like that. I said, well, then, you've never met a Nigerian. I'm happy to recognize the presence of the Nigerian High Commissioner to Singapore, who's just joined us. You're welcome. Because I said, we too are stubborn. In whatever we believe, we are very stubborn. I said, so I'm talking to you like that. Do you want to stay in detention or you want to get out? She said, okay, all right, what do I do? I said, you have to talk to them. And then I persuaded the military government to appoint, because Tanshu will never meet with Aung San Suu Kyi. I said, okay, you don't have to meet with her. Appoint somebody who can be the liaison officer, who will be able to begin the conversations. Now, I think we succeeded to some extent, but what are the reasons why? First, because I was here as an impartial mediator. I'm from Nigeria. My country has no, what the Americans would say, no dog in the fight. We have no national interest specific, no hidden agenda, even though I was an international civil servant, but a Nigerian. Secondly, I told the general, and that's what got me the entree, because you have to get inside first. Razali, Ismail, for 2.5 years, they didn't even let him in. So I had to fire him, because as head of political affairs, to whom he reported, I said, Razali, you are my friend, but I have to fire you, because what is the point of saying we have a special envoy who cannot even go into the country, you know? And then, of course, when I did, Kofi Annan, who is a very crafty old man, said, Ibrahim, you have fired my friend. Okay, now you take over. So I became both head of political affairs and special envoy to Myanmar. And I told the authorities, I said, look, I'm not going to lecture you about democracy and human rights. I'm from Nigeria. We've had our own share of civil war, you know, military rule, blah, blah, blah. But I was ambassador of the country when we were the pariah state at the UN, 1993, during the General Abacha years. And I was still ambassador of my country by the time we returned to democracy with President Obasanjo. So, you know, I have some experience on how you can move from being a pariah state to an internationally respectable nation if you give me a chance. And secondly, I said, I'll give you the ownership of the process. I'm not going to change your process. All I'm going to do is to help you quicken it, because I said they have something called seven steps roadmap to democracy. 7 steps. You know, by the time I started with the mediation, they were still at point 1. And that has taken 14 years. So I said, excuse me, if we continue at this pace, we'll all be dead by the time we go to the third, the third or fourth step. So ownership of the process, impartiality, ability to talk to the parties frankly, but also you need the support of the international community and the regional organization. I got the support of ASEAN, I got the support of neighboring countries, the big ones, India, China, and Singapore, not so big, but very important, because, why do I need that? Because the Western countries, led by the Americans, very critical of me, because they say Gambari's approach is too slow. They want Aung San Suu Kyi to be released immediately. They want the, what was that, saffron revolution, where the monks in 2007 revolted. That should have brought down the regime. So I said, no, regime change is not my mandate. This is the good office role of the Secretary General. I said, well, then we should go to the Security Council. But it's a futile exercise. And they know in their heart, because you go to the Security Council, if you get nowhere, just like in Syria, you know, the Chinese were going to veto any resolution on Myanmar. So ultimately, it is the Secretary General, when the Security Council is divided or deadlocked, that has to try to find a peaceful way, what they call the good offices role of the Secretary General. And of course, in the UN, we refer in a shorthand to the Secretary General SG, Secretary General. Okay? But Kofi Annan told me, say, you know, Ibrahim, what SG really means is scapegoat. When the big powers are stuck, or, you know, or they are pursuing policies that cannot work, they blame the Secretary General and his special envoy. You should see how I was abused. You know, Gambari doesn't know what he's doing. Just a bloody African mucking up in Asia. What does he know about Asia? Get him out, you know. But I must say the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon was the second one after, kept me there, even after the Americans say get him out, because the Americans are listening to the exile groups, you know, Burmese exiles in London, in America, in Thailand, and also to their own domestic constituents. But the reality on the ground was very different. So that was the opportunities and the challenges in Myanmar. For Darfur, it's even worse, because the 5 permanent members of the Security Council do not agree on what is the problem in Darfur. How should it be solved? The attitude to the armed movements who are fighting the government of Bashir. And I, as the jointly appointed African Union and the United Nations Special Envoy, had great difficulties reconciling, because illustration, Bashir, President Bashir of Sudan, is regarded by the West as a war criminal on Darfur, that is being indicted, to be tried, and taken to the Hague to be tried, convicted, and imprisoned. To the African Union, Bashir is head of state of a normal African country in good standing. Okay? Let me give you an illustration of the absurdity to which some of the big powers can go. In the United Nations, Bashir was elected in April 2010. I was just about 4 months into my post. In the first multi-party election in Sudan, which the Western countries themselves regard as having been free and fair. So the issue is, there was a big debate at the UN Secretariat, should Gambari go to the inauguration? Because by going, I'll be legitimizing somebody that they call a war criminal. And the African Union say, I must go, because you are our representative too, and we have no problem with Bashir. To such a ridiculous extent that the UN then decided, okay, well, since I have 30,000 troops there, I cannot absent myself from such a ceremony, but they warned me that I must not be caught smiling during the ceremony, so as not to seem as if I'm actually enjoying it. And the African Union say, go there and smile. So how do you smile and not smile at a ceremony? But it shows you that seems absurd, but the real difficulties. How do we resolve a conflict where the major party, the government, is seen variously by the African Union and the UN, and within the UN by the P3 and the Russians and the Chinese? But in the end, you have to, the progress we've made in trying to manage that conflict is to protect the civilians. You recall I said 2.1 million internally displaced people in Darfur. That is unacceptable. And my #1 role as head of that mission is to reduce the number of people in the IDP camps. How? By security, where they have left, so that some of them can go back. We were successful in that, but they also, you need some social services, because when they left, they destroyed, you know, no hospital, no schools, so you have to rebuild that. And thirdly, means of livelihood, because you can't dump people from the camps to their initial area of origin and say goodbye. You know, they will come back to the camps. So, but as I also mentioned earlier in my presentation, the problem is the international community is very stingy in spending money for building social and physical infrastructures for returnees and also for early recovery and development. And without that, in my view, there will be no permanent solution, because as long as people are in camps, it's a hopeless situation. You should see those camps, you know, where people feel hopeless. They've been there 6 years, 7 years, you know, all the extremisms. If you look Gaza, in Lebanon, in the camps, they are there, you know. So the recruitment of child soldiers, bad people to continue to fight, could be done easily the longer you have those camps. That's one. So you protect the camps, you protect the civilian population, you try to see how you can make it possible for them to go back. And also, my job was also to try to be proactive in the peace process. So I was not just only head of a peacekeeping mission, I was also designated as the chief mediator, which sometimes causes conflict, because in my capacity as chief peacekeeper, I have to deal with the government and depend on the government. But in my capacity as the chief mediator, I have to treat the government almost at par with their armed opposition. So there's also that challenge. And yet, if you separate them, it's even worse to try to separate the peacemaking from peacekeeping. I want to end just by saying that the first experiment in a joint mission between the African Union, a regional organization, and the UN is, in my view, fairly successful. It's not perfect, it has challenges because there's a division of labor. The UN provides the Security Council legitimacy because, according to the Charter, the Security Council has primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security everywhere in the world, including especially Africa, right? But regional arrangement under Chapter 8 of the UN Charter provides supports the regional efforts to do peacemaking and peacekeeping. But what the regional organization like the AU lacks, they have the troops. They have the most troops, but money and logistics. So the UN provides money, logistics, the overall collective security umbrella, but the African Union, they are doing the heavy lifting, and they are the one fighting and dying. The second aspect of this arrangement is that it could very well be the path to peacekeeping in Africa for the future, because pure UN peacekeeping operations in Africa, they are not working very well, whether it is in the Congo, or South Sudan, or Cote d'Ivoire, or even Liberia. But in my view, the chances of a collaborative effort, a mixed, what they call hybrid mission, African Union and the UN, is really has the best chance of success in Africa, provided that these missing elements of money for reconstruction, for early recovery, for dealing with the return of IDPs and refugees is provided, and the UN does better in peace building than just simply providing money for peacekeeping. And finally, you have to have a change of mind, because in New York, in the Secretariat, they don't like this peacekeeping, this joint African Union peacekeeping mission. Do you know why? Because they want control. They are used to total control, and now they have to share control. I'm told that some unreconstructed people in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations in New York regard UNAMID, that is the United Nations African Mission in Darfur, which I head, as United Nations African mistake in Darfur, which is not to be repeated. But in my view, that is the only thing that can make the UN continually relevant and provide legitimacy on the ground for these operations. Don't forget, the Security Council, which has ultimate responsibility for peace and security, in its present form, unreformed, unreconstructed, an arrangement in 1945 which is out of date, anachronistic, Africa is the only continent that has no permanent seat in the Security Council. So how do you expect to have legitimacy of that decision, of their decision, even though you have the responsibility? It's only, in my view, if you really align with the Africans to do peacekeeping and peacemaking. And so for me, that is the model for the future, for peacekeeping in the African continent. And that's why in the last review of AMISOM, the African Mission in Somalia, which I was privileged to head, we recommended that they should consider, because their mandate is being renewed by the Security Council this month, they should really consider a joint African Union UN mission for Somalia to consolidate the gains made on the grounds, because before there was no government at all in Somalia. State has collapsed. Now there's a modicum of a state, state services, there's a government, and so how to consolidate that is really to have this UN umbrella, but African Union as a partner in a joint mission, because the African troops also can do more things and more aggressively than the UN peacekeeping are prepared to do. That they can do actually peace enforcement. Whereas, you know, the Africans are willing to fight and die, whereas UN peacekeepers, troops from all over the world, they are very cautious and they say, well, we are peacekeepers, we are here to keep the peace. If there's no peace to keep, there's not much we can do, and we don't want to risk too much of our lives. We believe in collective responsibility, but only to a limited extent. So in my view, this is the wave of the future. Let me stop here and then take your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.